everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Can Automating Compliance and Auditing Be Your Competitive Advantage? We are very pleased to welcome you today to the session featuring Renee Murphy from Forrester and Vaughn Thurman, who is HighGear's CEO. But before we jump in, I thought maybe I'd take a few seconds to introduce myself. My name is Julie Bark, and I am the Chief Marketing Officer here at HighGear. And for the better part of 30 years, I've been helping companies achieve better business performance through a number of different types of strategies, and these do include process and workflow improvement at the team, department, and enterprise level for all kinds of organizations, different industries and different sizes. And as part of my role here at HighGear, I am very focused on bringing insightful and actionable thought leadership content to the marketplace so that we can help others realize higher levels of success as well. And that's really why we are here today. In terms of our agenda, we've already jumped into the first point, which is an overview of today's session. And I'll also be giving you a bit of background here on our speakers. We'll then move into the presentations by our keynote, and then we'll hear from both Vaughn and Renee as they discuss and share further insights on automating compliance and auditing. Our hope is that after spending about 50 minutes with us, give or take a few, you will have a better sense for how technology is impacting governance, risk, and compliance outcomes. We hope you'll also start to look at how automation can really offer you a true competitive advantage, how managing bad risk will help you take smarter ones, and lastly, we'll provide insight on policy as code. So now let's dive into the background of our speakers. First up, we'll be hearing from Renee Murphy, who is Principal Analyst with Forrester and an extremely accomplished governance, risk, and compliance professional. In the GRC realm, Renee has a special focus on audit and controls management, and she uses her extensive audit and tech experience to help clients improve their risk and compliance environments. She has a great deal of experience in program implementations, and she has served a number of industries, to include pharmaceuticals, entertainment, and retail. Given Renee's energy and creativity as well, I have no doubt that you will thoroughly enjoy her presentation as well as her perspective. Once Renee has completed her keynote, she'll be joined by Vaughn Thurman, who is HighGear's founder and CEO. Vaughn is also a very accomplished business professional and a serial entrepreneur with 30 years in tech. His passion is for helping organizations improve their businesses exponentially through accelerated digital transformation and better work management at scale. Vaughn's background includes the development and delivery of enterprise-grade software and other businesses in the tech industry. He also served in the U.S. Air Force during the Gulf War, and in terms of his industry background, Vaughn has a deep understanding of and experience in highly regulated sectors such as financial services and government. Just to give you a few examples, HighGear currently services NASA, Beasley, which is a large global insurer, and TC Energy, which is a well-known energy company. So with our intros and overview now complete, I'd like to hand things over to our keynote speaker to get us into today's session. So over to you, Renee.
Well, hi, everyone. I'm really super happy to be here. I'm going to go ahead and get my deck going. So policy is code, right? So what do I mean? Well, actually, I mean that pretty much what the government meant in the infrastructure bill, which means that if I'm going to create policy, IT policy, HR policy, I don't really care what policy, right? I'm going to have people in the room who can automate their compliance. I know, right? Like, Renee, what are you trying to do? Get rid of audit? Yes, I am. It's amazing. You see it a lot on YouTube. Go check it out. But this is how this has been elevated. You have to ask yourself, though, why? Why? It's Jell-O. Why? Right? But then I got thinking, like, what is the deal with Jell-O salad? And then I started thinking, it reminds me a lot about the story of compliance. So come with me while I tell you all about why it takes too long to comply. And it is exactly why we make it take so long to make a Jell-O salad. See, back in the day, medieval times, you actually, to make Jell-O, you would have to slaughter 10 pigs, take all of their bones and cartilage and everything, throw it in a bucket and actually cook that for like 10 hours. And then you would let it sit out until it congealed. You would scrape that off the top and that was your gelatin. Perfect, right? Perfect. Love it. What a great idea. Except that who has 10 pigs to kill? Kings. Kings and queens had 10 pigs to kill. No villager in a medieval times had 10 pigs to kill. So if you had gelatin on your table, my God, that you were rich because no one else would do that. The other interesting thing about medieval time, though, was actually auditors and tax collectors. If they came to your village, the first thing was if you got hired by the king to be a tax collector, like that's one notch above getting executed. Because when you went in to collect the taxes, there was only a 50-50 chance you were actually coming back. So when you got that job as the auditor of what people were supposed to be paying to the crown, yeah, you were taking your life into your own hands. But there was one royalty who really loved this idea of gelatin, and it was Napoleon Bonaparte. So whenever he would have a state function and there were people coming from other countries, he would create this chicken dish. Not him, the people in the kitchens would slaughter 12 pigs in order to suspend chicken in gelatin, and they would make it really, really tall, and they would shake it hard when they brought it in, and the person looking at it must have thought it came from who knows where. What is this? And Napoleon would stick his hand in the middle of it, pull out a leg of chicken, and just eat it and think it was the greatest thing ever, right? And it would really freak out everybody at the table. But then they figured, oh, okay, it must be edible. Who knows how he did this? Because who has 10 pigs to kill? Yeah, see how this goes around, right? So as you can see, like it's still taking a lot, and it is very expensive in order to have this kind of gelatin. It's still not available to the masses. But wait, it's the Industrial Revolution. And it's America. And we're living in urban environments where you couldn't keep 10 pigs even if you wanted to. So there was pretty much no chance you were going to get gelatin. But wait, it's the Industrial Revolution. We industrialized how we created foods. And one of the things we did was we figured out how to make Jell-O. So now all you had to do was reconstitute it in hot water, let it get to room temperature. It would gel again, and ta-da, it took like 30 minutes and you didn't have to kill any pigs. And it's 10 cents. Wow. Wow. What an incredible leap forward that is for Jell-O. Right. And you would have thought that's enough. I mean, how much more efficient can we get? But that wasn't it. Came the roaring 20s. All of a sudden the stock market crashes, right? We've been living high off the hog, forgive the pun, but we've been living high off the hog for a while. The stock market crashes. Nobody has any money. You need to make your food last for a week, not for a day. What do? You suspend it in Jell-O because it's still only 10 cents. It becomes a way to, kind of hold everything together and, make it go forward, right? Like that's what people were relying on that food for. Compliance kind of did the same thing. The 20s, we had no regulation. After that stock market crash, we introduced regulation, a lot of it actually. So with that comes more stability and the ability to make the economy stretch out farther into the future. Same thing we were doing with your food in the 1920s, right? Then we hit the mid-century. It's the 1950s. The cars have fins. The skirts are fantastic. The red lipstick, you can't get over it. And the Jell-O salad included bologna and hot dogs. I don't know. I belong to this vintage food thing on Facebook, and the things they do with hot dogs in the 1950s is just, it's mind boggling. But here's the thing. What happened was a couple of things kind of converged all at the same time to make Jell-O so complicated it was ridiculous. One was women's magazines. It didn't need to be this complicated, this Jell-O salad, but because housewives, you were a homemaker, you had to make the home. And to make the dessert really impressive, you did this kind of stuff to it. I mean, honestly, this one over here on the right, that has cauliflower in it. This one's got cucumbers and tomatoes in it, and it's probably lime Jell-O. This is what it took for you to impress people at the potluck. This is what it took for your husband to say, wow, that's a really great dessert, hun. He didn't mean it, but he said it to be nice, because you could mean it about this, right? But this is like the overgrown kind of thing Jell-O had to take in the mid-century. We had to make it so complicated that it seemed impressive, but we still don't need to kill 8 pigs to get it done. Compliance for me works the exact same way. Then comes the millennium, right? We're getting a little bit better at this. We're not spending as much time on it. It's starting to look more impressive. And really all it is Cool Whip, Jell-O, and some pretzels. Remember this one? This one went on for a long time. This one would show up at every company like potluck thing. This was the millennium. So yeah, we thought we're busier. We don't need to do this. It should look pretty. It should plate well, but that's all. That's pretzel at the bottom, right? Today, we call it agar-agar because people are vegan and they, gelatin is still made the same way, you guys. Jell-O's not vegan. You can't be a vegetarian and eat Jell-O. It's still made from the bones of animals, just heads up, right? Agar-agar, that's actually something that's made from vegetable everything. And this is what it looks like. Look how beautiful it is. And look how like the backlighting just kind of shows you how this is what they've done to Jell-O. I bet they charge you $15 a plate for this. Right? You elevate it to this point where now it's this beautiful tower of beautifully black backlit, sculpture. That's awesome, right? And it's $15 a plate. That's how they elevated it. Jell-O is going to be around for another 100 years. There's no doubt in my mind. And it's going to get complicated again because, otherwise you didn't work hard enough on it. That to me is the exact same thing. Compliance is as old as time. We've been doing it forever. You were run out of town as a tax collector. In Victorian times, this is when we talk about, compliance, this is why we no longer have children working in mines. Right? We decided we should put some labor laws in place. These kids belong in school. Thanks to Mother Jones, these kids belong in school. They don't belong in mines. We got a ton of labor regulation out of that. We got a little bit of banking stuff, but not enough to keep us from going bust in the 1920s. At the turn of the century, this is the first time, we're looking at food regulation. Right? The way we mass produce food actually matters now because we're doing it for large urban communities. And so, yeah, we ended up with a lot of regulation there. By mid-century, we had more accounting jobs than we had people to fill them. Hence, women accountants. I'm not being facetious there. It's like for real. Do you want to know why this woman's a network engineer? We needed more than we had, and someone gave me a shot at it. That was pretty much it. And that was a lot of us in IT back in the 90s. It was just way too many jobs and not enough people to fill them. That's this. This is what it used to take for an accounting department to do year end. Can you believe that? Like you working a couple extra hours that week, or maybe 20 hours. My husband does year end. I don't mean to be flippant, but it didn't take an army of people on 3 floors to get this done, right? But the thing is, we get to the millennium. We remember Y2K. I don't know if you guys remember, Weekly World News was the place you would go to for your ridiculous conspiracy news. It really was fun. Anyway, by the time year 2000 came along, we thought the world was going to end. So we need to be compliant now. Like that was, to me, the first big compliance exercise I ever had to do, Y2K. You had to go through all the servers and figure out, is there any code in there that says 1999 that's going to flip over to 1900 again? Because if it does, everything's going to be, we thought planes were going to fall out of the sky, cars were going to crash into each other. Just like, it was like the paranoia was ridiculous. People spent millions of dollars, millions of man hours updating code because the way we coded in the mainframe didn't allow for the year 2000. That kind of stuff doesn't go away. Like that's my like when I think of when I started in IT, like that's what everybody was talking about. It was all about Y2K. It was Armageddon. I don't understand compliance, right? Today, I'm a former auditor. It's no better. It's no better. Tell me they don't send 6 auditors to your corporation every time they come to do an external audit. Tell me internal audit doesn't come ask you for the same stuff 11 times a year. I worked in banking. I understand that, right? And don't tell me this isn't what it looks like over at, any of the big accounting firms. Of course it does. They're sitting in cubes and they're going through your paperwork. This is how it works, right? But the thing is, why? We have all the data we need to know we're compliant. Why aren't we getting it? Why aren't we putting it in the right place? Why aren't we collecting it and sharing it to prove our compliance? Why do we still hand over firewall configs to anybody? That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. And you know what? Maybe it takes someone who spent 17 years as a practitioner in IT to then go do audit. And I swear I only did one and said, this is the dumbest thing I've ever seen. Like, seriously, like, do you know, we already have all this data. We know how many Sev 1 issues, were closed in less than 4 hours. We know if any of them were closed in more than 4 hours. And if they were, and it was a Sev 1, it's a finding. Why don't we just run some exception reporting? Right. But then we get into the tricky stuff like manual process, like who signed in, who asked for a badge. When we get into the change management, incident management, problem management, that's just IT, right? All these like manual process, meeting minutes. My gosh, when you put meeting minutes into workflow, I can't even tell you how different your life becomes. Change management in workflow, it changes your life. I had change management meetings that were 2.5 hours. I'm terrified of the dentist, but I would schedule my dental appointments during that 2 hours because number one, change management was worse than the dentist. And number two, it was the last 20 minutes they decided anything. They just argued for 20 minutes or for 2 hours at the beginning. So at some point I decided, nope, going to automate this process, going to put it into a workflow management tool. And then we were down to 20-minute meetings because anything you had to say, I needed a record of anyway. So you had to put it in the tool. You guys, this is the kind of stuff we should be doing. This is what I mean by policy as code. If you're going to tell me the way that the controls are going to happen is going to be like you approve it, then I approve it, and then these people do, and then that's how we're going to do oversight. Fantastic. But we need to do that somewhere where we can report on it, trend it, and actually, do exception reporting on it. So when audit comes and we show them a whole dashboard of goose eggs, we don't have any findings. You can go away now. And if you're the auditor and you look at that dashboard and it's a bunch of goose eggs, there are no findings, you get to go home too. Policy as code is the answer to compliance efficiency. Okay, if you're wondering how I got to this policy as code thing and why I'm on the bandwagon, I was reading about New Zealand, actually, the country of New Zealand. And New Zealand adopted policy as code. So when they sit down as a country and think about their cybersecurity policy, they sit there with developers and security professionals so they can understand how to explicitly call out in their regulation exactly what you're supposed to do. And when I say exactly, I mean the code, right? So when they talk in New Zealand about policy as code, it's these big sweeping laws that they now like implement code with to say, we're defining what a week is. Because some people would tell you a week is Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That's when people are in the office. Some people will tell you a week is Sunday through Sunday. I think I would tell you a week for me is Monday through Friday. So everybody has a different interpretation. But if you want no gray area, guess what? You code it. And then there is no gray area. So it's funny that, New Zealand does it. And then the infrastructure bill came out and said, yeah, this is the way we want to work too. The US government, if you're going to do any work with the Department of Transportation and it's emerging technology, there will be security and development people in that room because they have to figure out what are you doing? How does that aid in compliance? And can we automate it? Because at the end of the day, policy as code means I have continual compliance monitoring. No more am I taking samples. No more am I, waiting for someone to come once a year. I know at the end of every day where I'm not compliant, and I can go resolve that if I want, because again, I'm managing all of this in process management workflow. And, I know a lot of people are like, Renee, so what? We still sign our change management. It's not a big deal. Well, yeah, it kind of is, right? Because at the end of the day, any data I would have had that would have helped me with managing the data center or the production servers or anything like that, right? Like if I can't go look up a server and it comes back and it tells me, here's all the change control that happened with it. Here's all the maintenance updates that happened to it. And here's all the stuff that was changed out of it. So when I'm having problems with that server, I know exactly what happened to it. I can't do that if y'all are signing paper and sticking it in a drawer. And that's just one, right? When I think of provisioning servers into a data center, or I even think about, onboarding new people into the company. Let's elevate it out of IT and talk about HR. All of that stuff. If there is a record of that, then there's a lot we can do about it. I mean, imagine being able to take all your process management information from onboarding new employees, and once a quarter, look at that data and come back and say, you onboarded this many women, this many men, and this many people from underserved, minorities, like, because your diversity program requires you to do that. If you're just doing that with W-2s, sending them off, having people sign a bunch of paperwork and walk away, we can't do any of that. Right? So you have to think about, like, if you don't put the data in, you can't leverage it for compliance on the way out. What you're doing is you're creating an atmosphere where compliance will actually have the data and they won't have to ask you for it anymore. And I know it's creepy, right? Because it's like, now we're in the surveillance world. You are already. You're there already. The only difference is somebody bugs you for 75 records. That's the difference right now. So who cares? Let them go pull their own 75 records. Better yet, I'll run an algorithm across the whole thing and bring you back what I know to be the problem, if that's what you care about, right? And how about I'll prove to you through my workflow management tool that I resolved this problem within the 3 days I'm supposed to, because it's a compliance issue. So you don't even have anything to say about that. And I'll say one more thing, because I don't want auditors to listen to this and think, Renee's trying to put me out of a job. No. I'm trying to put you in a better job. We need help with strategy, right? We need someone sitting there at the strategy level, listening to what we're planning, and then say, if I boil that down to what I know is going to be on the front line, here's where I think the compliance issues might be. I'm going to speak up now because it's cheaper that way. But we can't get out of being paper monkeys. Like, that's what I was. I remember my husband tripping over a binder on our floor at our first apartment. And it was like a 7-inch binder, and he tripped over it. And he's like, what is this? And I said, $1 million. It was someone's audit. It cost them $1 million. Like that. I don't understand that. We could do this in real time. We just need data, right? And those manual processes and even automated processes, we just need the data. And that's why I think process management is really, really important, right? So let's not make the same mistake as jellied food. Let's not think there's value in how long something takes. It's not true. Just because it takes 6 weeks and 10 people to do it doesn't mean it's any better than the software. It doesn't mean that you've had more, context. It doesn't mean that you had more understanding. It doesn't mean that you put anything that none of that is true, right? We need to start automating this stuff. We can't get to performance management by going around compliance. We have to go through it. The only way we can go through compliance is automation, right? And listen, we got a ton of places we can start. You don't have to start with, I don't know, finance or HR. Those are well-oiled machines. I understand what happens when you stick a fork in them. And I'm not saying go there first, but we all have sustainability goals. What controls are you putting in place to manage your sustainability? What are you leveraging to do that? How are you communicating across the organization, and how is the organization communicating with you? This is one of those places where policy as code, putting all the people in the room at the same time, can really help you build a program where you can trend data, see data, communicate information to all the people in the process. Sustainability is one of those really great opportunities to start thinking of policy as code. Ethics, because we're talking about environmental social governance, right? Ethics. This is another place where we can take some of this really seriously. Business processes for things like accepting gifts, giving gifts, things like, where we travel, who we do business with, whether we do due diligence on people on our board of directors. All of this is super important. Having the ability to manage that somewhere and looking at it from a policy as code perspective, we certainly don't do that. There's not a ton of companies I know of that do background checks on their board members to make sure that there's no one on the board that's a felony. That's not usually how that stuff works. It could work that way if you had some good process. And listen, at Forrester, this is the year where we're talking about trust. I say good for us. It's called the trust imperative. And, I say it a lot. If you follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter, I say it a lot that this is how, you need to build trust, don't test it. There's companies out there that test trust every day. Facebook tests people's trust. They're losing the battle lately, though, right? And then there's other places that build that trust. Apple, I would argue, builds that trust. They protect private data. They protect their customers' information. They'll go to the mat with the FBI over it, right? Facebook, not so much. So that's the difference, right? So, and if you look at whose stock is rising and whose reputation is golden, it's not Facebook. So building trust is really important. How do we do that? With transparency. How do I do that as somebody who's an auditee? I give you 100% of the environment to go ahead and look at. I don't expect that you're going to pull something from last, quarter, from the month of June. I expect you to look at everything done from January 1st to today, right? Because if I'm doing it right, then there should be no problem. And I want to be that transparent with the organization, because that's how I build trust with my end users. And I'm seriously, like, there's no better way to do it. I've tried I'll bring donuts. Seriously, trust us, we'll not wreck your stuff anymore. There's someone in charge now. Like, it didn't work. Like, at some point you just have to put up or shut up, right? And the only way you can put up is, can you prove what you're doing in order to build that trust? You can, if you have the data. And if I have the data, then I can get rid of the audit. Do you see where I'm going with this? And auditors, as long as I'm doing that stuff and you can monitor that in real time, it's now time to go talk about strategy. Sit in on those meetings instead. Sit in the meetings where they're deciding whether or not they're going to do business in China. Sit in on those meetings on whether or not they're going to take on cloud, or some other emerging technology. That's where you belong. Let all this other stuff be managed some other way. So my takeaway to you is, think about policy as code. As you're going through creating new things, new controls, do what NASA does. If you bring NASA a control, if they say, all right, manned mission to Mars, what are you doing about the fact that, like, in low Earth orbit, if they can get that far and they have a damaged craft, how do we get them out of it and back to Earth? And let that thing go, because at least they're still in low Earth orbit, because who knows what happened, right? How are we going to do that? If I brought them an answer that couldn't be monitored, they would reject it. It wouldn't matter how brilliant it was. Like jettison them in some kind of machine where it just flings them out far away from the ship. And then they can remaneuver themselves and kind of fall down to earth. Sounds like a good idea to me, right? But if I don't have the metrics to prove that, I'm not allowed to bring it to the board. Start thinking like NASA. If you cannot automate that control, don't bring it to me. Because at the end of the day, as we refresh these policies every year, and I don't care where they are in the organization, we need to start thinking about automating manual process. We need to start thinking about leveraging business process tools to move data around the environment, to share it with the people involved. And hey, I think R&D should start thinking about sustainability. I think workflow could help with that. Right? So that's what I'll say. And Vaughn, I'm gonna close this out. I'm gonna ask you to come talk to me. But what are your thoughts about all this? I mean, business process management stuff is really, really important. I think, especially when it comes to compliance, but I think it also gets you a really long way in this conversation of as policy as code. So what do you think about that?
Just realized I was on mute. My apologies. As you were going through the presentation, I kind of recalled a famous quote from Winston Churchill: "When you're going through hell, keep going." Right? And I think so many people feel like that in compliance, like and because you said the only way through compliance is through, right? And we're gonna have to get all the way through this. And the strategy of staying compliant, I think, is greater than the tactics of proving compliance after the fact. And when we had a prior conversation, you kind of used this metaphor of the operations people. The fund manager is out there in the Bugatti going 180 miles an hour trying to push the envelope, and the auditors in the 73 Pinto, about 8.5 miles behind them, picking up papers along the edge of the road. And this model that you wanted was really to put the compliance people into the Bugatti as
Right. They don't have to drive. They just put them in the back seat. They're good at, hey, watch that lady. Watch the lady. Like, that's what they're good for. right?
That's right. It's the navigator, right? You know,
Yes.
they're basically along saying, "Hey, this turn up here, you can't see around it, but it's really sharp. So slow down for this one,
Right.
so that we don't have an accident up here that slows us down." They're really partners in the acceleration of the business, not you know, not an obstacle to it, right? And so when you get to this policy of code model, and I think of code as if then else, right?
Hmm.
And that is not programming. If then else logic is absolutely the same thing you do drawing out a process diagram.
Hmm.
So the world is changing, and in that, you know, policy is code, which I am 100% on board with. It has now moved into the realm with no code, where regular people who are the operations people who want to drive the Bugatti 180 miles an hour can be stakeholders in an extremely rapid process of making sure we've mapped out that rally race course that we're going on. And so now compliance is coming along with me, because I can't both operate at 180 miles an hour and remember that turn 3 has an obstacle in a blind
Right.
spot in there, right? So I found it really interesting, and like I said, it reminded me of that quote from Winston Churchill, because at the end of the day, you know, we can either look at compliance as being something that's going to slow us down, and we can just sort of trudge through mud forever, or we can keep going and push ourselves all the way through it and say, let's turn this into a competitive advantage, where while our competitors are trying to figure out how to prove they were compliant with what they did last year, we're going to build compliance into the Bugatti, and we're going to leave them in the dust, because
Hmm.
they will end up eventually, even if the 73 Pinto's 8.5 miles behind, when the Bugatti crashes on a corner, management out of fear will tie them together with a long rope, and they will then forever be limited by the speed of the 73 Pinto. So
There you go. We're all going to be in the Pinto, and God help us if that thing's in a rear end collision,
yeah.
because we're all dead. We're all dead. That's what I remember about the 73 Pinto. But you're right, right? Like, and that's what most organizations do. But again, it doesn't matter when the Bugatti gets there. I'm still in the 73 Pinto picking up those papers on the side of the road, because damn it, that's my job. Right. And I just feel like that's just, that doesn't help. It doesn't help anybody. It doesn't help them take less risk. It doesn't help us figure out, what is at risk. Like, it just doesn't help. And so, yeah, and you're right. The rapid application of environment of business process stuff. I've told you the story, Vaughn, about how I was so frustrated with the U.S. Census and how they spent like $500 million, and I figured out how to do it in workflow management on a handheld device in 2000. Like, it was ridiculous. I could save the government $400 million if they would just use a rapid application workflow management tool, right? I mean, it was ridiculous, but that's the kind of efficiency we're talking about. And that's the kind of rapid application environment you're talking about. I used to build this stuff in 20 minutes,
Hmm.
right? There's something
Right.
to be said for that.
Yeah, right. And by the way, I see three responses to regulation. And the reality, regardless of how anybody feels about it, is that regulation is growing. And, you know, so there are three responses I'd see to it. It's the guy who had the kids in the mine and is waving his arms and legs. How dare they come in here and tell me I can't have these kids working here? And that, you know, that's angry response number one. We got angry response number two, which was, I never employed kids. Why do I have to do all this paperwork now
Right.
to prove that I'm not employing kids, right? And then there's the third response, the person who says, we've got our affairs in order. We're just going to make minor changes to our process very quickly here to assure that we can, you know, we've read it, we've figured out what they're looking for. And the beauty of most of these compliance regimes is that they are simply a system by which you keep honest people honest and identify the people who never were, if you have that kind of organization and process. So you make that tweak to the process to say, hey, turns out we do employ some kids here, but it's only for things that kids are allowed to do. So we're going to build a workflow that says if their age is above this, we can send them into the mine. If their age is below that, we've got to make sure they're not heading into the mine, and that we store some extra information. That's that compliance along the way. Hey, slow down on turn 3 here. And I love what you did in terms of setting up the model. And I've seen clients do it really well, um, where they think about and bring their compliance teams into the design stage of building these things, right? And I think you talked about that a little bit, but seeing that in practical execution, where as opposed to it being an afterthought, saying, "Hey, we intend to go win this race. We're going to drive 180 miles an hour. Would somebody like to come and tell us where the risks are?" Really bringing them in and saying, which track should we pick? Where can we minimize risks and maximize impact? Not the negative kind of impact, but positive impact. And the idea that you're laying out the clarity is very much like that navigator having the map there, and it's really now just a matter of, can I read that map in real time, as opposed to coming along like an FAA inspector with a bunch of pieces of a plane on the ground after the fact, looking at it. It's, can I get them in the car? Can I get them in the process? So I'm just very much on board with this, and I've seen people that have compliance people doing it. I've seen people that have process centers of excellence, and I've seen people that have no idea what to do still succeed just by applying some technology to it. But I've also, and I'm going to turn it around and ask you a question on this.
Yeah.
I've also seen a lot of organizations that are just continuing to struggle with this. And I wonder if you could share some of your insight, because of the broad array of clients you've talked to who are on the starting line and the finish line and the midpoint with this. What are the things that you think are keeping people from being able to adopt this modern approach to compliance?
I think one of the things is that people are terrified that there's never a good time to change. And I literally mean that. So if you're living in a heavily regulated environment, like that's the stuff you need to manage, there's never a good time to change. Audit's always there. At some point you're going to fail something because you're in the midst of change, right? And so like no one knows how to actually fundamentally do that. So I'll see people in large banks, or you'll see people in large manufacturing organizations, and they'll tell you, I would love to add to my, I don't know, third party risk stuff, things related to cybersecurity, but I don't have the expertise for that. And quite frankly, we don't have the time. And it's like, wait a minute, time out. Add this URL to your form, your automated form, click that, look at the score, write it here. We're good. Like it's seriously that simple, right? And so when you say we just have to make sure that that kid should be in the mine or not be in the mine, right? Like it's the same thing, right? Like at the end of the day, like it took a tiny change. I had to change what was in a drop-down list. That's all I had to do. And now
We lost your audio again.
Oh, sorry about that.
It's the excitement.
I know, right? And then you see me flailing my hands, but nothing's coming out. Can you hear me now, though?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, but it's, when people talk to me and they say they're in that mode of, I just can't change, they usually put it on the back of compliance, ironically. So we can never change the way we're complying because we'll be out of compliance, which is crazy, right? But at the same time, I get their point. In some really compliance heavy organization, you passing that audit is determining whether you get a bonus or not. I mean, they're that compliance driven, right? In those organizations, those changes are hard to make, really hard to make.
Well, we've got some clients, I won't share names, but in lines of business where failing an audit can lead to executives spending time in jail or being at risk of it, right? And those kinds of things keep people up at night. Yeah, yes. I don't want to take any risks in my risk management program.
Right. No, it's for real. Like that's paranoia is for real. But I would remind everyone that audit works in a very specific way. If you said to me, I automated this, now I say, well, show me the outcome, and then you show me what it gives you in the end, and I say, okay, show me where everything was configured to give me this. And so I'm not talking to you anymore. I'm talking to the platform now. I got to figure out how this thing's configured. What did it do? Who did it go to next? Once I get through all of that, I can rely on the data. Once I can rely on the data, we're done. Anytime someone, because I've written this up that I rely on this data, here's where it's all coming from, everything like so I believe this report. Now, if this report happens to be, Vaughn, something like, bring me back all the change management that didn't have user approval and weren't maintenance. Because maintenance, I don't need user approval, but it's still in change control. But did anybody actually do this and not get the users to sign off that it was complete? And if it brings me back nothing, I have no findings, and that was 100%. Like that report went through all of the records that we have and brought back nothing. That means there were no findings. That once the auditor relies on that, that's it, we're done. So the next time I come back and do that audit, if I'm internal audit or external audit, the evidence I'm looking for is that zero. That's it. right? So it's worth it to make the change because you're changing everything that happens after that. And yes, it is messy in the middle because everybody has to figure out what just happened. But what I will say is I worked in a heavily regulated environment. I documented everything to death. Here's the workflow. Here's all the users. Here's what they have rights to do. Here's what the process is asking them to do. Here's how long it stays in each state. Here's when an admin would touch it. Here's all the records for that. And here's where the log is. Like that's what I would do. Hand it to the auditor and say, let's sit down and talk about how this works now. And then we go through all that. And then they sit down in front of the application. I show them all again and we're done. Here's the report. It's a 0. Okay, great. Thanks. I'm out of here. Like that should be how it works. So yeah, it's a little bit of work in the middle there, Vaughn. It gets messy, right? But it is worth the mess.
Right.
If you could just get out the other side of
The
it.
time savings are phenomenal.
Yes,
We've
unbelievable.
worked with an organization and it was an exceptional case, so I don't want to claim that everybody will get the same results, but they went from it typically taking 17 weeks of on-site review to a 45-minute review. Right. And it's one of those things where, yes, it was a lot of work to think through how things should work and make sure that all the correct evidence and artifacts were being gathered along the way. It's really about capture and display, though. If you've captured the right data along the way and just made it part of the process, then displaying it becomes incredibly easy, incredibly quick. And the confidence factor that people would have after that first year, they didn't live in fear of audit. They didn't go into this panic of, right. And there were no midnight fabrications, right? Where, and I'm not suggesting anybody will resonate with this, but I've heard stories of people saying, well, we all had to stay up the night before the auditor would come, backdating things. And most auditors are smart enough to say, I can't help but notice the same handwriting and pen color on your entire year worth of logs of, 50 people signing into a data center, right? You talked about two other things that I wanted to jump into, though. One was sustainability. And, one of the things that we've run into, especially with some of our customers in the government space, there's a real challenge with human capital management and knowledge transfer. And, as some of the folks who have been in an agency for 20 or 30 years, and this isn't unique to government, but, have been in an agency for 20 or 30 years, they have become the all-knowing answer person for everything that gets stuck. And when that person suddenly comes in and says, I've made my decision, I think I'm going to retire in July, the organization goes into a panic and says, okay, we've got to have people follow them around and figure everything out and start writing things down, and they end up with massive documents that nobody has the time to read. Whereas, it's sort of like someone shared a story with me recently of grabbing a video camera and getting in front of their aging relatives and saying, tell me the family story while you still can. Right. And workflow is the same thing. It's the family story of all that human competence that we've built up over the years, which, by the way, makes the organization more sustainable as you migrate important duties from very senior folks who just instinctively and intuitively know what to do, down to young upstarts who are full of energy and have no idea of the risks they're taking when they go flying into turn 3 at 180 miles an hour, right? So it's the whole concept of sustainability is really migrating from workarounds to workflow.
Yes.
And putting the value in the process instead of in the people. And it isn't to say you don't need valuable people. It's that you're getting people out of the business of providing value in low value areas, so those same people can provide value in high value areas. And then the last thing was you talked about trust. And I had a story that someone had shared with me from financial services that I thought resonated here as well. And they were really talking about the fact that the outputs for clients, if we're doing our job right, are the same outputs we need for staying compliant, for managing risk, right?
Yes.
And so just like we will scare our auditors to death if we don't have things, just like we'll worry our risk managers and they'll want to strap us to that 73 Pinot, we're going to worry our clients if we can't consistently put out something that confirms, hey, the call you made today, here's an email confirming that we heard you. Here's another email confirming we got it done. Amazon has gotten great at this with the consumer experience, but so many B2B organizations have not realized or B2C that are in financial services, that are in government, haven't realized that they have the same opportunity and they actually have the same obligation, and that if they do it, if they make sure they're gathering the artifacts and the information it's necessary to prove to an auditor that they've done their job, they're gathering the same things they should be communicating to their client, their customer, and vice versa. If we're doing a good job gathering and communicating to our client the value of what we've delivered to them, we should have already proven what we need for the sake of the risk manager, for the sake of the compliance process. So it
I
really
always,
resonates with me and what I see out there in the field. It really
yeah,
resonated with me.
yeah, and in a lot of ways, you're preaching to the choir, right? I mean, I remember working in .com, where we had absolutely no process. But if you wanted to be good at it and didn't want to work 1,000 hours a day, you had to do something, right? And I remember working with the woman who did our QA, and she's like, "Well, we do bug tracking." I'm like, "What's bug tracking? Like, seriously, what's that?" She's like, "Oh, it's this stuff. It's just software we use where we create a bunch of workflows. So when the developer sends you something and it doesn't work, you send it back, and then they do something and they send it back to you. You just have to draw out the workflow." And I remember looking at her being like, "You've got to be kidding me. This stuff exists. Like, why are we not using it to do onboarding and offboarding? And how come we're not doing it to figure out, SOX, attestation? Like,
Yeah.
why aren't we
Yeah.
actually using this stuff?" And for me, it changed my life. Like, everything in IT started, any manual process that I was responsible for ended up in bug tracking software somewhere, because I wanted to be able to report on the back end. And you know what? I'll tell you, I remember one time Vaughn telling someone, workflow management software can take your audit from 6 weeks to 6 hours. And they threw me out of the room. They threw me out of the room, Vaughn. Like, that can't possibly be true. This is some kind of scam. You're out of here. And I'm like, wait, no, I'm not kidding you. I'm not kidding you. Just pay the time up front. I promise you this is going to work. But no one could see it. So yeah, you're preaching to the choir on this one. I think this is super important. It's important for compliance. It's important for operations. It's important for risk management. And it's important for performance management. Again, we don't get to performance management, how fast or slow we drive the Bugatti, until we go through the compliance question, because we're not going around it.
That's right. That's right. And I think a line they say in the Army when they're teaching excited young recruits how to do things that have risk in it, smooth is fast.
And yes, right?
Right.
Slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right?
Hmm.
And so be deliberate, think about what you're doing. And again, I think having compliance in the room and having developers and having security folks in there as you're designing out this policy or you're figuring out these controls, it runs that exact same thing they always teach us about system development, lifecycle management. Fix it in QA, and it's like 10 times less money.
Well,
Right?
Renee, something else that you touched on too is, how quick you were able to build these things. You were a network engineer who stumbled upon what somebody was doing with bugs, and
Right?
you brought that over, right? And I think that, again, as technology continues to march forward and get these kinds of capabilities within the reach of more operational stakeholders, I think one of the obstacles to this change that I think is coming down, and I think a lot of operational leaders owe it to themselves to reevaluate, is that they can actually have a bigger influence in less time to managing that risk ride-along relationship than they think. It's not the old scenario where I describe it to a business analyst. The business analyst takes it to a document. The document goes to a programmer. The programmer writes a prototype 3 months later when they have somebody available, and they bring it back and show me, and they say, "My God, everything's changed. We've already got revision 2 of Dodd-Frank out, right? There's new guidance on this. The FAQs have been updated."
Yep.
And they go through that process forever. And the reality is, and you were talking about even doing it in 2000, is that low code and no code has really gotten it down to the point where the technology is no longer lagging behind. Technology is no longer the 73 Pinto. It's really the mindset. The technology is caught up to the point where that 180 mile an hour fund manager, operations leader, pipeline manager, the land, deal maker, can now say, here are the rules we play by in our org, here are the rules we have to play by in our industry, and I need something that will keep those guardrails up for me. I need you to move the hay bundles, right, by this afternoon. And that's actually become a reality. And I think it's exciting to hear you advocating for it the way you are, because I think that refreshing change, that new vision for compliance being a real-time partner, I think it for the folks that embrace it, I think it really will become a competitive advantage. I think it really will be something that leads, what it'll be the compliance divide, right? The folks
Right.
who get it and realize I can't make regulation smaller. I'm not in control of that, but I am in control of how we
How I
respond to that
respond.
regulation. And if I can make it extremely fast and lightweight for me as an organization and get it to the point where it becomes a beneficial accelerating advantage over my competitors who are still trying to figure out how to pick up the papers along the highway, I think that's really an exciting future versus the painful one.
Again, it's the Jell-O salad story. Don't make it complicated for no good reason. There's a reason why it's this fast. It's just more efficient and it's stable on the shelf, for real. Like, there's a reason why it's that fast. Don't turn your compliance program into a giant mid-century Jell-O salad.
Wow, that's a great line there.
Well, on that note, this has been an incredibly enlightening conversation. And Renee, your presentation was fantastic. We are so grateful that you were able to join us today and really highlight the ways in which auditing and compliance can be a competitive advantage. I don't think people think much about that in
You
the context of
should.
those two things, and they
I,
should, absolutely.
I've been talking about it for 10 years. There must be something to it. I mean,
Yeah,
if I'm still this excited over it, there must be something to it. Yeah.
Yeah, we couldn't agree more. So we are again so grateful that you could join us today. Vaughn, thank you for sharing your industry insights as well and for engaging the dialogue with Renee. For those who don't know and are not aware, HighGear is a leading workflow automation platform, and we're very proud of our capability in the area of audit and compliance. So I've put some information up on the screen for you in terms of our website and where you can reach us. And we want to thank you for giving us your time today and for listening in.